Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, rating and ranking the Power 5 conferences in 2017. Not completely ranking them because we're just looking at the Power 5 games played non-conference. So this is a closed experiment. We're not including those games against the FCS or against the Group of 5. And of course, a conference and a number of them did suffer some bad losses against the Group of 5, some worse Group of 5 teams and some FCS teams occasionally. And then also those good games, those really good wins against solid and really good Group of 5 teams are not taken into consideration either. But consider this a closed experiment, so it's a very pure procedure we've got going here. The Big Ten is up next, 16-7 in 2017 against the ACC, the SEC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12, boosted by that 7-1 performance in postseason play. All right, then we've got to put these games into context, because if you just look at the wins and the losses and say, okay, Big Ten 16-7 must be the best conference, it played the best, 16-7. Well, what were those wins? Well, we know Ohio State lost to Oklahoma in a like-seeded matchup. Oklahoma the 1 seed out of the Big 12 and Ohio State the 1 seed out of the Big 10. But the Buckeyes also got some points for the Big 10 in defeating USC, the 1 seed out of the Pac-12. Well, let's run them down. So in those 16 games that the Big Ten won, those 16 teams for the Big Ten won 123 and they lost 48 overall. That's a really good winning percentage of almost 72%. In the games in conference, these are really high-seeded teams in the Big Ten. So think about that. The bowl games really amplify this because the good teams, the top half of the league, plays in the bowl games, and the bad teams don't play in the bowl games. So typically, you do have the better teams in the conference representing most of these games because they go out and schedule the better teams typically, and then they play in bowl games. Illinois didn't play anybody in the Power 5 non-conference, and then they didn't play in a bowl game. So Illinois is not represented here, for example. So the 16 teams in those Big Ten wins went 123-48, 72%. Overall. More importantly, this is more telling because we don't know who they played in the Group of 5 or the FCS. That is very sporadic. But within the Big Ten, they went 81-40. So these are really good Big Ten teams. This is a lot of Ohio State, Wisconsin, Michigan State. All right, so they averaged to a 4 seed. And if you check out the videos I've already produced on the Pac-12, Big 12, and ACC, that is a significant number there. These were really good Big Ten teams playing these games. For the other conferences, it's been in the 5.5 to 6 range for the wins. So the Big Ten, as has been the narrative the last few years, relying on the top half of the conference to boost the conference. All right, they beat some pretty good teams. 89-72, 55% are the 16 teams that lost to the Big Ten. And more importantly, again, in their leagues, in the Pac-12, with all those bowl games that they played against the Big Ten, in the SEC and the ACC and the Big 12, they went 55-40. They won 58% of their games in their league. So these were pretty good teams, and we'll run down the games in just a second. But they averaged a 6 seed. So that's, on average, in those 16 meetings, that's a pretty significant advantage for the Big Ten. To win 16 consecutive games in those matchups is pretty darn impressive, but they did have an advantage and should have won most of those games as a 2-seeded advantage on average. Okay, in the losses, 52-35, that's 60% for those 7 teams out of the Big Ten that lost those 7 games. They won 60% of their games. They won 60% of their games in conference, so they were pretty good teams at a 5.7 average seeding. And I explain in the initial video, the first video, where I introduced the process, where I got my seeds, strictly from the standings, but then I had to adjust it to a 14-team seeding for every conference. So there's a lot of decimal points involved for the Pac-12 and the Big 12 because I had to adjust the seeding. That makes sense. 64-29 are the teams that beat the Big Ten. They won almost 69% of their games, and they were pretty good in conference. So take this into consideration. That the Big Ten did lose 7 straight games, these 7 games against very like-seeded teams. those 17 Big Ten teams won 60% of their games in the Big Ten, and they lost to teams that won 59% of their games in the Big 12, the ACC, the Pac-12, and the SEC. 5.7 the average seed against a 5.58. So teams just slightly better than them. Okay, so it's a 14-point scale because we've got 14 seeds, 14 teams in the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten, and then I adjusted the seeds in the Pac-12 and the Big 12. So it's a 14-point system per game. So, for example, when Ohio State beat USC, that's a 1 seed for the Big Ten. It's actually 1.17 seed for the Pac-12, but we won't split hairs here, but I did all the calculations to come up with that number. So when a like-seeded team beats a like-seeded team, so a Big Ten, let's find a matchup here for the Big Ten. Wisconsin as the 2 seed beat Miami as the 2 seed out of the ACC. That's a like-seeded game. So we just take those 14 points, we give them to the Big Ten, plus 14 for the Big Ten, minus 14 for the ACC. Now, when it's not a like-seeded game, for example, Wisconsin's win against BYU in the regular season, Wisconsin the 2 seed, we gave BYU a 12 seed. I explained that in the introductory video. It makes sense, a 12 out of a 14 for BYU, which went 3-9. So Wisconsin the 2 seed, BYU the 12, we took away 10 points off that win. So the Big Ten only gained plus 4 points for that victory. Let me go with one more example because it involves a win against a Power 5 opponent. Northwestern over Kentucky in the bowl game, the Music City. Northwestern the 4 seed out of the Big Ten. Kentucky the 8 seed out of the SEC. So there's a 4 seed difference. So the Big Ten did win the game and should get credit for the win, but it wasn't a like-seeded matchup. So I take away 4 points from that 14-point win for the Big Ten, and they get 10 points, plus 10 for the Big Ten, minus 10 for the Kentucky loss for the SEC. All right, so if you add all that up and take away the losses versus the wins, then you get a plus 96, or just a shade below, for the Big Ten. Here were the wins for the Big Ten, and consider the seeds, and I'll run them down for you. And I'm going to round off some seeding, decimal points, and so forth. But they go into the math. Ohio State, the 1 seed, beat USC, the 1 seed out of the Pac-12. Ohio State, a 1 seed, beat a 10-3 Army team, which calculated to a 7 seed. We've got Penn State over Washington. Penn State, the 3. Washington, the 3 seed out of the Pac-12. It calculates to a 3.51 in a 12-team league. Penn State beat Pitt. Not a huge win for the Big Ten there because Pitt's the 10 seed. Penn State's a 3 seed. But still a win for the Big Ten. Big win for the Big Ten here. Michigan State over Washington State in the Holiday Bowl. The Spartans, a 5 seed. Washington State, the 4.68 seed. They were the 4 seed in the Pac-12, adjusted for the 14 teams, 4.68. Michigan beat Florida on opening weekend. The Wolverines, a 6 seed. Florida, an 11 seed. Maryland, this is the biggest seeded win for the Big Ten in terms of seed difference. Maryland, 2-7 in the Big Ten, 11 seed. Defeated Texas, the 5 seed out of the Big 12 Conference. Actually, the 4 seed, but adjusted 5.6 seed. So that's a 6 seed difference practically, and the Big Ten won it. Indiana over Virginia, that was a 12-13 matchup. You had Wisconsin over Miami. We talked about that, a 2 versus a 2. Wisconsin over BYU, a 2 over a 12. Northwestern, we talked about that, defeating the Wildcats of Kentucky, a 4 versus an 8. And then 2 good wins for the Big Ten, but not huge here. Purdue, like-seeded matchup with Arizona in the bowl game. Purdue wins as a 7 seed over Arizona, the 7 seed. And Purdue as a 7 seed defeated Missouri 35-3, the 9 seed.